On the evening of December 15th, 1995, a handful of engineers at Digital Equipment Corporation quietly moved a small project off a lab server and onto a single web address. No press release, no announcement, nothing but a plain page and a search box. They had built it to prove that a new computer chip could handle heavy real-world traffic. Within 24 hours, that side project had been hit with 300,000 searches, more traffic than almost any website on the internet had ever seen in a single day. It would go on to become, for a few remarkable years, the most powerful search engine on Earth, built years before anyone had heard of Google. Digital Equipment Corporation gave it away anyway, not once, at least 3 times, with 3 different pieces of the future, built by the same company that had already reshaped computing twice before. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what kept forcing DEC to hand its own inventions to someone else, right up until the day the company itself, the one that had built every single one of those pieces of the future, was sold whole to someone else entirely. Rewind almost 40 years earlier, to 1957, inside a leased corner of a 19th century mill in Maynard, Massachusetts, that had once woven blankets and uniforms for soldiers in the Civil War. 2 engineers named Ken Olsen and Harlan Anderson had just left MIT's own research laboratory to start a computer company. Except their investors would not fund a company with the word computer in its name, so they called it Digital Equipment Corporation instead, and spent the next 3 years quietly selling circuit boards, not computers, just to prove to their own investors that they could be trusted with the money before ever attempting a machine of their own. The investment itself was small by later standards, $70,000 for a majority stake from one of the very first venture capital firms in the country. Only in 1960 did Olsen and Anderson finally build a computer, a machine called the PDP-1, sold in small numbers, mostly to research labs and universities. It would take DEC 5 more years after that to build the machine that actually made it famous outside a handful of laboratories. In 1965, DEC released the PDP-8, the first computer, small and cheap enough, under $20,000, to be called a minicomputer at all. More than 50,000 of them sold to scientists and engineers who had never before been able to put a computer directly in their own lab instead of waiting in line for time on somebody else's mainframe. A later machine in the same family, the PDP-11, would go on to become one of the best-selling computer lines of the entire decade. Then, in October of 1977, DEC went further, introducing the VAX 11780, a 32-bit machine that ran an operating system called VMS and could do things mainframes, costing many times more, could not. The VAX line turned DEC from a company worth around $700 million into one worth $14 billion, and by 1988, it was the second largest computer company in the entire world, behind only IBM itself. That same era, at a conference for the World Future Society, DEC's own founder had said something that would follow the company forever, that he saw no reason for any individual to have a computer in his home. Nearly every retelling of that line since has left out what he actually meant: a centralized machine running an entire household's lighting and heating and entertainment, not the personal computer sitting on a desk. It became a myth anyway, repeated so often that most people now believe DEC simply refused to see personal computers coming. DEC did try to sell them, it just never managed to make that market its own, the way it had made many computers its own. By 1990, this was still a company at its absolute peak. More than 120,000 employees worldwide, over $14 billion a year in revenue, engineering the machines that ran banks, universities, and research labs across the planet. Customers did not just buy DEC hardware. In many cases, they built entire careers and entire academic departments around it. The kind of loyalty that makes a company feel, from the inside, like it can never actually run out of road. By 1990, the numbers finally caught up with the engineering. The United States slid into recession, and personal computers and open, non-proprietary systems were eating into exactly the high-margin, proprietary mini-computer business DEC had depended on for 2 decades. Customers who had once needed DEC's own hardware and DEC's own operating system to run anything at all could increasingly buy cheaper machines from several different vendors and mix and match the pieces themselves. For the first time in its history, the company posted a loss. The next year, 1991, it lost money for an entire year, also for the first time ever. In June of 1992, DEC's own board did something it had never done in 35 years. It created the title of Chief Executive Officer, a title Ken Olsen himself had never held, and gave it to a company vice president named Robert Palmer, effectively ending the founder's run at the company he had started in a Civil War-era mill 35 years earlier. Palmer began cutting the workforce that had once numbered over 120,000 people, and it was in the middle of that very restructuring, 3 years later, that a handful of DEC's own researchers built something nobody at the company had actually asked for. They needed a way to prove that DEC's new 64-bit alpha processor could handle enormous amounts of real internet traffic. So they built a search engine capable of indexing the full text of the entire visible web as the demonstration. It was never meant to be a business. It was meant to sell computer chips. On December 15th, 1995, they quietly switched it on. Within a day, it had absorbed 300,000 searches, and within months, it was answering something like 13 million queries every single day, more traffic than almost any other address on the internet. It was, by any measure, the accidental invention of the decade. Here is the part most people miss about AltaVista, so stay with me, because it explains everything that came after. DEC did not build a search company. It built a chip demonstration that happened to be the best search engine on the internet, and it never fully treated it as anything else. There was no dedicated search division, no plan to compete with the search startups that would arrive a few years later, just a research project inside a company that made almost all of its money selling hardware to businesses, not software to the public. That same instinct, invent something extraordinary, then hand it downstream as a way to move hardware, repeated itself just 2 years later with a chip called StrongARM. In 1997, DEC sued Intel, accusing it of copying patented ideas from DEC's own alpha processor inside the Pentium chip. Intel countersued. And when the two sides settled that October, DEC did not simply collect a payment and walk away. It sold Intel its own chip factory in Hudson, Massachusetts, and the rights to StrongARM itself, a chip design Intel would later rebrand and sell inside a generation of pocket computers and early smartphones. DEC's own press at the time called it a right result. For a company that badly needed cash after 2 straight years of losses, roughly $700 million from a rival probably felt exactly like that. But it meant that 2 of the most forward-looking things Digital Equipment Corporation had ever built, a search engine built years ahead of Google, and a chip architecture that would end up inside a generation of mobile devices, were now both owned by someone else. And Digital Equipment Corporation itself, the company that had made them, was running out of time to build a third. This is the part most people get wrong when they tell DEC's story as a simple tale of missing the personal computer. So stick with me, because the real pattern runs much deeper than one bad prediction. By 1998, Digital Equipment Corporation was no longer the second largest computer company on the planet, and it was no longer independent enough to decide its own future. Compaq, a company we have already told the story of on this very channel, had not even existed when DEC introduced the VAX, and it had spent the 1990s racing to sell more personal computers than anyone else in the world, and it wanted something DEC still had, that Compaq did not: decades of enterprise customers, a global service and support network, and a brand that banks, universities, and research labs still trusted. In June of 1998, Compaq completed its purchase of Digital Equipment Corporation for $9.6 billion, at the time the single largest merger in the history of the computer industry. A company that had opened for business inside a Civil War-era mill 41 years earlier, and that had once employed well over 120,000 people, was now simply a division inside somebody else's balance sheet. AltaVista went with it. 15 months later, in August of 1999, Compaq turned around and sold most of its stake in AltaVista to an internet holding company for stock and notes worth roughly $2.3 billion combined. The demo that DEC had built just to sell computer chips had, by the time it changed hands for the second time, become worth close to a quarter of what the entire parent company had just sold for 3 years earlier. DEC's own engineers had built it to move computer chips. By 1999, it was one of the most valuable single things anyone connected to DEC had ever owned. What followed was not a bankruptcy. DEC never filed for one. It was something closer to a slow dissolving. The DEC name survived for a few years, stamped on Compaq products, then disappeared from the market almost entirely when Hewlett-Packard bought Compaq itself in 2002. The Alpha processor line, once the fastest chip architecture in the world and the entire reason AltaVista had existed at all, was phased out within a few years of that second merger. AltaVista itself changed hands again after CMGI, eventually landing at Yahoo, and slowly lost the search engine wars to a company that did not even exist yet, when Digital Equipment Corporation's engineers first switched their own accidental search engine on. StrongARM, meanwhile, kept going strong under Intel's new name for it, X-Scale, quietly powering pocket computers and early smartphones for years, exactly the kind of personal computing device DEC's own founder had once been misquoted as dismissing entirely. Ken Olsen himself lived to see almost none of this unfold from the inside. He had been gone from the company for years by the time Compaq closed the deal, watching from the outside as the company he founded in a Civil War-era mill finished disappearing into somebody else's org chart. There is an uncomfortable symmetry sitting underneath this entire story. Compaq spent the 1990s becoming the company that could finally outcompete DEC on price and scale, only to disappear itself into Hewlett-Packard just 4 years after swallowing Digital Equipment Corporation whole, the exact fate DEC had suffered at Compaq's own hands. And the myth that still follows Ken Olsen everywhere, that he was a man who could not see the personal computer coming, sits uneasily next to the fact that engineers inside his own company built the best search engine on the internet and one of the chip designs that would define mobile computing years before either technology went mainstream anywhere else. DEC did not fail because it could not invent the future. Almost everyone who has studied the company agrees it did that better than almost anyone in its industry. It failed because inventing the future and owning the future turned out to be two completely different skills, and DEC, again and again, only ever had the first one. Almost every company in this genre of story falls because it stopped inventing, because it got comfortable, because it stopped taking risks. DEC may be the rare case that fell while it was still inventing things nobody else had thought of yet, right up to the very end, and never once figured out how to hold on to what it had made. Digital Equipment Corporation is not a story about a company that missed the future. It built pieces of the future 3 separate times: the Minicomputer, the search engine, the mobile chip architecture, and let every single one of them go to somebody else, usually for cash it badly needed at the time, sometimes almost by accident. The lesson underneath the myths and the misquoted speeches is a quieter one. Building something extraordinary is not the same as knowing what you have built, and a company that keeps treating its own breakthroughs as side projects will eventually watch someone else turn them into empires of their own. If you used AltaVista before Google existed, or you remember a DEC terminal humming somewhere at work, school, or a research lab you once worked in, tell me about it in the comments. And if you want to see how the company that finally bought DEC lost everything too, we have already told that story on this channel, so subscribe and go watch it next.